Okay, it's time to get started. So, Frederick here, and in this webinar, I will introduce you to compliance requirements in the EU. And we're going to cover regulations that apply to basically all consumer products in the EU: REACH, FCM, CE marking, GPSD, packaging, Authorised Representative, and at the end, Amazon Europe compliance requirements. So the structure is very similar to the previous webinar covering US compliance requirements. Now, quick about me. You're probably familiar with me. Name is Frederick, and based in Hong Kong, where I'm the director of Asia Portal Hong Kong Limited, which operates ComplianceGate.com and a number of other websites. My background is in product development and manufacturing. Used to live in Shanghai and later in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. We're based today in Hong Kong, and you can also find free articles. There's actually a lot more than 100 these days. Free webinars that we send by invitations by emails, video tutorials, digital downloads, and more. As with every webinar, you can also ask questions. So I suggest that you use the contact form, and I normally get back within 24 hours. You can ask throughout the presentation. Now, this is not the first time you see this, I reckon, but I just want to remind you, because it really goes back to these 4 points all the time. When it comes to compliance, it's generally so much more than just receiving a product certificate from a supplier or getting a product lab tested. Yes, that matters. You need to comply with safety standards and substance restrictions. And yes, you need to get the product tested to verify that the product in question is compliant with a certain standard or substance restriction. You may also need documentation that can be a self-issued compliance document, a declaration of conformity, a technical file, and labeling requirements. So it's really about technical compliance, actually designing your product to be compliant, actually instructing your supplier that use materials that don't contain, say, bisphenol or certain phthalates. Okay, that's number one. You need to have it properly documented. You need to get it tested, and last but not least, correctly labeled. There's so much more that goes into this than just receiving a certificate. There's a lot of misunderstandings about what compliance really is. So yeah, just wanted to remind you before we get started, because these 4 elements, they come back throughout this entire presentation, as we today will go deeper into EU compliance requirements. Number 1, we have REACH, and REACH is a very important regulation in the EU, even in the world. What REACH does is restricts chemicals, heavy metals, and also other toxic substances, organic pollutants, for example, in all consumer products in the EU, not for certain age groups, not for certain users like FCM, like food contact materials, not just for toys, all consumer products. Okay? This can be lead, cadmium, DHP, that's a phthalate. Okay? What it does is that it can ban a certain substance. It can set a limit on a certain substance, like 10 microgram, for example, or milligram. I think microgram is very low. And different restrictions apply to different products. Okay, I think they have certain restrictions for baby bottles, just to give you an idea, and pacifiers, compared to, say, T-shirts. Okay. Ultimately, testing is mandatory. It's necessary. It's not I don't think it is mandatory, actually. But what is mandatory is that you need to ensure compliance. And in reality, at least as an importer, your only real choice is to get your product tested. So it is necessary to get a product lab tested, a material tested, to verify that your product is compliant. Okay, that's really the only way. And in this case, compliance means that you take this infant wear, for example, pajamas or whatever you call it, that this fabric does not contain certain substances above the set limits. Okay, and labs can also help you to actually make that assessment based on a product, based on a material. They can say, okay, these are the substances that are on, I think that was Annex Yeah, some of those Annex 7 or something, I can't remember exactly, we specify on our website. Um, and based on that, they can then assess and decide which substances to include in the testing checklist. So that's REACH, and that's yeah, it goes first because it's so important, because it's something, doesn't matter what you sell in the EU, you need to take it into consideration. Number 2, we have the EU food contact materials regulations. That more than one, I think all of them go under the EU food contact materials regulation framework regulation. And the framework, the EU FCM framework regulation, it covers all food contact materials. That means anything that's in contact with, well, food or beverage, kitchen utensils, food packaging, other food contact products. Okay, and what it does is, well, as you can see, it's very similar to the FDA regulations that I covered in a previous webinar about the United States. But what it does is that it restricts, or well, either bans or limits chemicals and heavy metals in plastics, metal, ceramics, coatings, paints, printings, and so on, anything that's in contact with food or beverage. It also restricts migration. Migration meaning, okay, you have this plastic food container, does substances migrate from the material into the food or beverage when it's, for example, heated in a microwave oven? Well, it shouldn't. Okay, and likewise, they also set requirements not just for migration of chemicals and so on, but it shouldn't alter the food. The smell or the taste. Okay. Lab testing. Once again, I actually don't know if it's mandatory, because sometimes it's more open-ended like that. Because you can use other methods to ensure, at least a big company may be able to. When they write these regulations, they try to be, let's say, open, so they don't make it too strict, because that could damage certain businesses. But end of the day, I'm not aware of any other way, unless you have an in-house lab and engineers, well, chemical engineers, to actually carry out the test for you, than lab testing. So lab testing, at least if you're an importer, you're an Amazon seller, it's really the only way to verify compliance. Another thing that's also unique for the EU is that, at least for certain types of plastic FCM, you need to issue a declaration of compliance. Okay, doesn't necessarily mean that the entire product is made out of plastic. It could be like this one, that on the lid on the inside is actually, there's some plastic part here. That means you still need a DOC. A declaration of compliance is different. It's not the same thing as CE marking declaration of conformity. Completely different, just so you know. So that's FCM. Now we're going to look into clothing and textiles. Fairly straightforward. Again, REACH applies, but I already covered that. So what really matters is labeling requirements. You need the fiber composition. It could be 10% spandex, 90% polyester, 100% cotton. As long as it's an accurate description. You need care instructions covering washing and so on. It needs to be a permanent label, not just a little sticker somewhere. And this is also this is a bit more tricky. It needs to be in the language of the member state where you sell the product. So what do you do if you sell online? I'm not sure how they deal with that. I think most of them accept English. But yeah, you can find more information on the EU website. I mean, naturally, it would be you need a fairly big label if you would have every single language, and I doubt that the customs authorities would start to confiscate it. Say that Polish customs would confiscate it because the label is not in Polish; it's only English and French. Give me an idea. And keep in mind, this is not just for clothing, but also other textile products. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is that additional safety standards apply to children's and infant wear, okay, covering drawstrings and so on. I think it also covers flammability. So then you need to comply with tighter restrictions. All right, a big one is REACH. REACH is also big, almost as big. Is a CE mark. Now, CE marking is a compliance mark. It tells me as a consumer and the retailer and regulators and everyone really in the EU that this product is compliant with the safety regulations that apply to this product. That's the intention of the CE mark. Now, the CE mark itself doesn't magically make a product safe and compliant. Don't have that level of technology yet. But the CE mark, it's the compliance mark. It signals to me as a consumer and a retailer and so on that the product is safe and compliant. Now, in order to CE mark a product, there's a lot more that goes into that than just printing that logo, the one that you see right here. Number one, this really comes down to ensuring compliance with certain directives. The Low Voltage Directive, RoHS, Toy Safety Directive. It's a very diverse range of different products that must carry the CE mark, because the way it is, if the product goes under one of those directives, it must carry the CE mark. It's not that, yeah, you can if you want. No, it must carry the CE mark, and vice versa. If the product is not within one of those directives or regulations, it doesn't fall within their scope, then it shouldn't carry a CE mark. So CE marking is not a quality seal. It's not something voluntary. Okay? Now, in order to claim that a product is CE marked, which is a requirement if it falls within the scope of one of those regulations, you need to not just confirm which regulation it falls within, but also make sure that your product is tested according to the safety requirements under that regulation. Okay, I will get into that in a bit. So that's the first thing you need to do. Once again, it tends to be a bit more open-ended than saying testing is mandatory. But end of the day, unless you have the expertise and the equipment to carry out these tests in-house, then you need a third party. So I would say that all of our customers, for example, they need to work with labs. So that's why I specify it as it actually works for our target group, for our audience. Documentation. You need to issue a declaration of conformity. This is basically a statement. It could be a one-page statement saying, this company hereby certifies or declares that this product, SKU 001, is designed to comply with this regulation and this and that standard, for example. Okay, name, date, location. You can Google this declaration conformity sample, and you will find plenty of them. It's a self-issued document. You also need a technical file. A technical file is basically an extended product specification, bill of materials, list of standards that you apply, design drawings, PCB schematics if it's a electronic product, a risk assessment, photocopies of the packaging, user manual, and so on. Basically, everything goes into your product, and it can also help you and the authorities to assess if your product is actually compliant based on this documentation and the work you've done to ensure compliance. Test reports, as explained, a user manual. Okay. Now, for some products, you also need a third party to review your documentation and sometimes even inspect the production facility. Okay, and also carry out testing. That's called a notified body. It's primarily the case for PPE, personal protective equipment, and medical devices. Maybe for some other products too. I'm sure there is, but I only deal with this stuff within the scope of consumer products. I mean, it's CE mark that applies to, say, explosive items, but yeah, that's we don't really work with that. So next big question is, which products require CE marking? And as said, my work and expertise is within stuff that sold on Amazon or a Shopify store. Don't really deal with gas tanks. Just to give you an idea. Don't deal with explosives and so on. But when it comes to this category, I say electronics, big one of course, toys, bikes, PPE products. That one is quite big. Work gloves, but also helmets, sunglasses, certain face masks, medical devices, machinery, and some construction materials products. Okay? So this gives you an idea. I'm going to go through these one by one. So first we have electronics. And when it comes to electronics, there's a number of different directives, and these directives they apply. Well, in almost all cases, you have to ensure compliance with more than one directive, and each have their own unique requirements. So we can start with RoHS. RoHS sets restrictions similar to REACH, but specifically for electronic components concerning heavy metals like lead, cadmium, mercury, and so on, and also certain phthalates. And yeah, the limits are different compared to REACH. That's the reason. But that's number one. And this applies to all electronics. Ultimately, comes down to instructing your supplier to procuring the right materials. It's the same with REACH. You need to instruct your supplier, use REACH compliant fabrics, use RoHS compliant components. If you don't instruct them, then they may not use compliant components and materials. So RoHS is number one. Then we have the low voltage directive. This is based on input voltage. So anything that you really plug into the power socket go under LVD. That's and that's because it covers electrical safety. Okay. And that's also why there's so many issues with these cross-border e-commerce sellers shipping unsafe chargers that explode. It's a big problem actually. Not to mention lithium batteries that explode. That's a big one with these hoverboards a few years ago. Anyway, that's the second one. And then it really comes down to, okay, what kind of device do I have? If it's powered by, say, AAA batteries, and it doesn't have an input, it doesn't have a charger, there's no charger, then yeah, it may not apply. EMC directive, this covers electromagnetic compatibility. For certain devices, especially like big screens or machines, they need to be shielded. Let's just not go into extreme detail here, but they may need to be shielding. This needs to be considered at a design stage to ensure that device does not interfere with other electronics. I remember in my first few years working in mainland China, I was working with another Swedish customer in Shenzhen, and they were buying these big LED screens. And they've been hearing from other people in the industry that, yeah, this EMC is really risky, because there was another company that they put up one of these gigantic LED billboards next to a port facility somewhere in the country. And as it turned out, it was interfering with radio communications in the port. That's a big problem when something like that happens. So they had to take it down. They had to remove it, and it wasn't compliant with the EMC directive. That's what I want to get to. Okay, there are exemptions. You take something, like such little quartz watch. It's not going to interfere with any radio communications anytime soon. So then it's different. Then you may not need testing. But otherwise, EMC, yeah, it does apply. I think even kitchen appliances, I think they even test EMC compatibility for that. Number 4, we have the Radio Equipment Directive, and this is similar to FCC, which I mentioned in the former webinar. It covers anything that's wireless communications, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, LTE, 5G, GPS. It comes down to frequencies. So yeah, it's also about not interfering with other devices, really. Something that's rather unique for the EU is the Eco Design Directive, and this is really interesting. If you look on energy efficiency, energy consumption in the EU, well, Europe, since the 70s, it's been consistently. Europe is significantly more energy efficient now than it is in the 70s, say pre-oil crisis, and this is really interesting because it really originates from necessity, and this means that European devices are actually, starting in the 80s, I think, became a lot more energy efficient, and today this is covered by the Eco Design Directive. So that's the last one. And this is mainly, I wouldn't say it's not exclusively, but mainly concerning certain home appliances and also lighting products. I don't think it covers, say, like these. I don't think, say, wireless earphones would go there. Right. So as I said, oftentimes you need to take more than one into consideration. So give you an example here: Bluetooth speakers and an AC adapter. So number one is electronics, so we know it's ROHS. Okay, the AC adapter, it needs to comply with LVD because the input voltage connected to the power socket is actually a specific limit. So it depends on if it's AC or DC, and yeah, I'm not going to go into detail, but just to give you an idea. So the AC adapter, it has a 230 volt input voltage and an output voltage into the Bluetooth speaker with 5 volts. So the Bluetooth speaker would also need to comply, the speaker itself would need to comply with RED because it has wireless communications. Okay? And I think the Eco Design Directive may actually apply to the AC adapter. I'm not entirely sure about that one. But just want to show you how you take one product and different regulations can apply. Different directives within the same category can apply. So it's important to have an idea, okay, what goes where? What are the conditions? All right, then we have toys, which must comply with the Toy Safety Directive, which in turn, I think it only refers to EN 71. And EN 71 is a set of European standards, harmonized standards, that the Toy Safety Directive, as with other directives, like they broadly say, okay, it needs to be safe, it needs to be this and that. And the standards, then, EN standards, they give us the specifics, the specific testing methods, the specific ways to design a product technically, or the specific flammability requirements, the specific chemical limits, okay, the specific graphical symbols. So this gives us an overview, a broad definition, whereas this goes into details. And that's also why this is interesting, because imagine if you would try to cover all toys by the same requirements. That wouldn't work, okay? That wouldn't work because there's a lot of different toys. And that's why there's EN 71. You may not necessarily need to comply with all of these parts, okay? Like this dinosaur toy wouldn't comply with, like, we go down here, 14, trampolines for domestic use. Yeah, you jump on this one, and yeah, it didn't send you off 5 meters into the air. No, you don't. It's different parts apply to different products, okay? So up to you or testing company to make that assessment, okay? And I highlighted 4 of them because they are quite interesting in telling about the way compliance for toys work. So EN 71.1 it covers mechanical and physical properties. Small parts shouldn't break off. Small parts shouldn't detach, and so on. Yeah, it really covers, and not just that, but also sharp edges and so on. You shouldn't. A child shouldn't cut themselves on a product. So it needs to be designed, like physically, it needs to be safe to use. Okay. Then there's flammability. It speaks for itself. Specification for migration of certain elements. Once again, we get back to chemicals and heavy metals restrictions and migration, especially products that can be placed in the mouth of a child. Even that is taken into consideration. And labeling requirements. So once again, you can see that a diverse range of different requirements that apply, even within the same directive. And keep in mind, they all need to be CE marked. The ones I show now with the orange headline, these are all these are products that all have to be CE marked, just so you understand the context here. We're not done with CE marking yet. Right, then we have PPE, the Personal Protective Equipment Regulation. And examples include sunglasses, safety goggles, helmets, gloves, protective gloves, even protective footwear. And devices are classed into different categories, class 1, 2, and 3. And for certain products, you also need to work with a notified body, meaning they need to review your paperwork. They may even need to inspect your facility and also do maybe even a retest of your product. Medical devices, well, this is broadly speaking products designed to protect the patient. Prescription glasses, medical masks, medical gloves, wheelchairs, laser devices, and so on. And again, high risk category also requires a notified body for some types of products. Machinery, here we have e-bikes, electronic fitness equipment, moving parts, you can say, automated moving parts. That's sort of what it comes down to. And I think notified body may be required for some of them. All right, so those were the main CE marking directives that I wanted to introduce you to. And keep in mind, it's you have different product regulations, in turn cover different standards that they all require the CE mark. So that's really what that was all about. Another big one in the EU is the General Product Safety Directive. And this is sort of the catch-all regulation, in the sense that, okay, you got a product, it doesn't fall within the CE marking regulations. Does that mean that you can sell whatever unsafe crap on the market that you want? No, of course not. Of course not. Note how the Toy Safety Directive, for example, covers toys, doesn't cover children's furniture. The GPSD is, the purpose of the GPSD is to ensure that all consumer products that are sold in the EU are safe. Okay, that can mean a lot of things. That can mean different things. The GPSD, it does reference safety standards and testing standards for a very wide range of products. Okay, products that don't require the CE mark, for example. Okay, and this is to ensure that the products are generally safe. Now, the GPSD doesn't reference safety standards for everything. There are actually new products being invented from time to time, and inventing a new product is not a free pass to sell unsafe products. If there are no reference standards for your product under GPSD, then you can look at other standards that may apply directly or indirectly to your product, and that can still be applied to your product to design it for safety and also test it accordingly. There could also be national standards on an EU level, or better than nothing, use international standards, say American standards. But there are many EN standards that you can follow. So yeah, the GPSD is really for everything else. If it doesn't go under CE, it's not an FCM, then yeah, GPSD is a better reference point then. And importers and manufacturers can still choose to create a technical file and a user manual. But keep in mind, this goes outside of CE marking. All right. As a follow-up to previous two, the GPSD and the CE marking, we also have EN standards. As I explained, as already touched upon with the Toy Safety Directive, the directive itself is quite, well, it broadly tells me that, okay, you're selling toys, they need to be safe. It's a little bit more specific than that. But got different types of toys, and different types require that standards are, technically speaking, defined in different ways. They even have one for finger paints. It's not just about toys, though. As mentioned under GPSD, they list, I think they call them harmonized standards, listed referenced under GPSD for a wide range of products. Okay, this can be, say, baby carriers or bedding items, assessment of ignitability of bedding items, pillows and so on, smoldering cigarettes. Is it called a cigarette test? That's actually a lab test I've done myself. Fairly low-cost equipment. Did it in Shanghai a few years back. Another one, EN 13772. Textile and textile products, burning behavior, curtains and drapes. Because at the end of the day, if your product is unsafe, it can be pulled from the market. Regardless of whether you follow any standards. So it's in your interest as an importer or Amazon seller to ensure that you do everything you can to ensure that your product is compliant. And sometimes that is doing a little bit more than the bare minimum. So that's why we also have EN standards. Now, in some cases, it's mandatory to follow them. You take the CE marking directives. Then it's not a choice. You have to establish a directive, and then you have to decide, okay, which standards do I need to follow, or ask a lab or a consultant to do it for you. Okay, next one we have product packaging, and it's actually another directive that limits heavy metals in packaging materials. This test is fairly low cost, and it's something that your lab can do for 50 to 100 US, I think. Now keep in mind that packaging compliance also covers labeling requirements, which in turn depends on the product. So it's the CE marking. It's not just on the product, but also on the packaging in many cases. The WE mark, that's the waste bin. Sure, you've seen it. The knife and the fork symbol. Energy label, that's mandatory to show energy consumption and so on. Traceability, there's a number of them, but that's not really about the packaging itself. That's about the product, and which labels you need depend on what's inside it really. Okay, then we have, starting in 2021, it's mandatory for cross-border sellers to have an authorized representative. The background is that in the last few years it's been really big with some of these cross-border e-commerce websites where consumers, not businesses, but consumers go and buy, whatever. And these are products that don't comply with EU regulations. In many cases, unsafe products, exploding charges, unsafe toys, and so on. People keep buying from these websites. I don't know why. And I'm not going to mention any of them. But yeah, starting in 2021, things have changed. So the requirement is that cross-border sellers, meaning that you're a non-EU company, you're selling into the EU, okay, you're a foreign overseas company, non-European company, you need to have an authorized representative, okay? The role of the authorized representative is to check your products and act as a contact point on your behalf. Your product, the mechanism, the enforcement mechanism, what these guys will look at, what they are looking at, is whether your packaging has a European address or not. Okay? If it doesn't, you can't ship it. Well, it can be destroyed. They can't check every unit, but the difference is that, I mean, they could destroy unsafe products before. The difference now is that they can just destroy it on site without any approval from the buyer and the seller. No notification needed. Okay, so they are basically being empowered to a new extent compared to before. But you need an address, and this is a lot more complex than just getting some virtual address. You need a EU authorized representative address, and they in turn don't just sell you the right to use their address. No, the authorized representative, I don't know how they become an authorized representative, but they in turn have responsibility, not for the product itself, as far as I understand, but at least they have to check it. They need to at least do what they can to assess the product. So what these authorized representatives, or EU ARs, they require that you provide full compliance documents. And keep in mind, this is cross-border sellers, not European importers. They require, in some cases, that you obtain product liability insurance. And this means that if you don't have complete compliance documents, then you can't keep selling. And I think this is going to become the world standard in the future. Matter of time until we see the United States do something like this. It's a matter of time and until we see the People's Republic of China, Japan, Korea, India, and so on. Because cross-border e-commerce is becoming a matter of sovereignty, actually. The UK is, by the way, doing the same thing as part of the EU. So we're seeing these walled-off markets. This is selling cross-border is just becoming a lot more difficult, and for good reasons, because there's been a lot of unsafe crap that's been crossing the borders in the last decade, drop shipping and so on. Okay. Another thing the EU has to do is to take care of communication with the EU authorities when asked. So this is giving the EU authorities a gatekeeper and a contact point. And as said, it all comes down to getting an address, but it's not about just buying an address. For example, Amazon is providing a AR service. Product IP is another option. Okay, speaking of Amazon, This is from Amazon Europe. Okay, it's the UK, but it's actually concerning a EU regulation. So what is happening here is that Amazon has written to a seller telling them that, okay, we have removed your product because we don't have enough compliance information. Okay, we don't have enough information about your product. We want to see that your product is REACH compliant. You see here, REACH. And they want this seller to provide a lab test report proving that the product is compliant. Now, what documents do Amazon often request? As said, lab test reports, but it also comes down to what's actually required for the product. If you take toys, they will also ask for declaration of conformity. If it's FCM, they will, in addition to the lab test report, also ask for declaration of compliance, and so on. Product label and packaging images. Why? Because they want to see if it's correctly labeled. Does it have the CE mark? And sometimes they also ask for supplier invoices if you provide compliance documents held by a supplier. So Amazon, at least in the EU, they tend to follow the compliance requirements in the EU. Okay, so you're selling toys, you need to comply with the Toy Safety Directive and REACH. As we see now, Amazon is actually requesting compliance documents proving REACH, which means a test report according to the relevant REACH regulated substances. This means that, in theory, Amazon could request compliance documents for any product. In the past, let's say that it was more common when it came to electronics, high-risk electronics like containing lithium batteries and also children's products. But the way that the direction they are taking is that they are just becoming more strict across the board. Sometimes they can go beyond mandatory requirements. This is more common in the United States. I'm not aware of them doing this in the EU so far, but who knows? And with this I mean Amazon saying, okay, we require that you comply with otherwise voluntary standards. And that's something we see quite often in the United States with UL compliance and so on. Now, failing to provide compliance documents, it's not just, okay, you sort that next time. That product can't be sold. It's just delisted. You even have to remove it within 30 days. Okay, you don't have all that much time to ensure compliance. It's definitely not optional, and they're only getting stricter when it comes to this. The problem is that by the time that you receive something like this, right, one of these messages, it's often too late. It's already too late to try to get a product tested. You need to get it out to the warehouse. It takes 2-3 weeks to get a product tested. What about labeling? What if they come and say, hey, your product's not CE marked? How are you going to relabel that product? So you can't just hold off until they ask you for it. You need to be proactive. You need to make sure that you have the right documents and right labels and test reports and whatever before the cargo leaves the factory. Okay. Now, talking of factories, why bother with this stuff? It's so complicated. I know I know it's not fun. I'm not a bringer of joy. I understand that, but the truth is that it's not so simple that you can just ask your supplier. That's often what many of these do, that they receive one of these requests from Amazon and they turn to the supplier, asking them to provide, hey, okay, can you send this test report? Almost taking it for granted that they got their back. No, the thing is that most manufacturers in Asia, outside the EU, I mean, even in the US, can provide full compliance documents. And the thing is that those that do, I mean, you take a big brand like, I don't know, Huawei or something, they already have this themselves. You know, they don't need an importer. They don't need an FBA seller to be a middleman. The companies that are at that level of sophistication, they already sell on Amazon themselves. And we have Chinese customers. We have Vietnamese customers. I'm not speaking of factories now. Factories and e-commerce companies. A lot of sellers from say Shenzhen are actually not factories. That's a different story. And the reason is that it's not their job. And it's also economical factors. If they would test every single product before they even know it's going to sell, especially if you want to go in and make changes and that lab test result is invalid, it wouldn't make sense for them to test everything. It doesn't work like that, okay? Because at the end of the day, if you go and you make a change, you change a color, you change a feature, or you come with a brand new product, well, there's no compliance documents that can be applied. Okay, so you need to do retesting anyway. So you won't get anything from the supplier. Another mistake is sellers that they reach out to the supplier. The supplier just managed to dig out something in on the hard drive, some old product certificate or maybe a test report. The thing is that you can't take a test report for a different product, a different SKU, and say, oh, this applies to me. As I mentioned it during the US compliance webinar, you cannot CE certify an entire factory. It goes down to specific product, specific SKU. You change one component, previous test reports are invalid. Okay. Sometimes you take, like the Toy Safety Directive, I think they actually mention in there that you need batch testing. Okay, you can't use a test report from April 2018 and apply it to September 2021. Okay, a production run in September 2021. Give you an idea. Okay, and Amazon is they know these tricks. Okay, they're not gonna just say, oh wow, well it says CE certificate, I guess this is good enough. They're not like that. They have good compliance people on their team, on the compliance team. Likewise, you can't submit test reports held by a different supplier. Okay. What often happens is that Amazon sellers receive these invalid, bogus product certificates that sometimes mean absolutely nothing from their suppliers and hope that, it will somehow pass. But they reject invalid compliance documents. So be very careful with what you submit. Should only submit when you at least think that this is correct. These documents are correct. This is what is required. So just asking your supplier for some random PDF or JPEG file and just forwarding that to Amazon, it's just going to spell disaster. Yeah, just a repeat. Okay, so I know it's a lot to take in, and I'm going to summarize this part of the webinar with a checklist. So the very first thing you need to do is to confirm product regulations for your product, because that in turn decide, okay, is testing needed? What documents do you need? What labeling do you need, and so on. Number one. Number two, which product standards may apply? I look at EN71, for example. You got 20 different parts of something. Maybe 3 apply, maybe 5. And substance restrictions. Which are the chemicals that need to be checked? Which heavy metals need to be included in your testing checklist? And what are the limits? Good thing is you can get a lot of help from the testing company. 3, what product and packaging labels do you need? And I emphasize packaging because a lot of importers, they tend to overlook the fact that it's not just about product labeling but also packaging labeling. Okay, CE marking, traceability, and so on. Okay, so sometimes you need more than one label. 4, confirm documentation requirements, declaration of conformity, declaration of compliance, technical file, user manual, language requirements, test reports, and so on. Testing, meaning, do you need testing? Yeah, most likely you do. It's really the only way, unless you have your own facility, which, our audience tend to be SMEs, so that's less likely to be the case. The good thing when you work with great testing companies like Kima, TUV, SGS, Intertech, they can help you assess which substance restrictions apply, which standards you need to work with. They can help out with labeling and so on, but that tends to be quite expensive. But it's a very good start at least to get that assessment. And sometimes, this is rare, but you also may need a permit or some sort of approval. Not usually the case for consumer products, but something to at least take into consideration. So this checklist gives you a pretty broad overview.